Maybe you got this advice the way I did. My first real boss and my first real job said the words that still ring in my ears, quote, "You know what happens when you assume, don't you? You make an ass out of you and me." Well, that taught me a real-life lesson that Washington has never learned, because it may have been our founders' intent to build our republic on the Constitution, but modern-day D.C. is built on assumptions. Nowhere is that more apparent than in the way we tried to build a budget. Now, you may have heard in civics class that the president proposes and the Congress disposes, but actually both those branches of government formulate their own budget plans, and they're built on theoretical forecasts, really, of how both sides see the world. How best to explain this? Well, since there are two major parties with two very different perspectives, let's offer two variations on the same theme. And since we're now in the post season, that is to say post-Christmas and post-Super Bowl, the best example has to do with expanding waistlines. A conscientious, well-intentioned dieter may set the goal of losing 5 pounds per month, so that in 6 months, 30 pounds would be gone. Taken by itself, it sounds fairly modest and achievable, but it fails to account for possible illness or injury that might derail regular exercise, or perhaps just the impulse of bad habits that spark a return to late-night refrigerator raids. Suddenly, what seemed reasonable suddenly becomes unachievable. Now, let's take it a step, or actually several pounds further. No one would dream of telling a morbidly obese person, eat as much as you want, anything you want, whenever you want, don't worry about exercise. I'm telling you, you're going to lose weight because it says so right here in my 10-year forecast. When you get right down to it, those two different variations are really what Washington does. All of Washington makes assumptions based on intentions, and those intentions prove unrealistic. Maybe it's fitting the president was interviewed from the White House kitchen on Super Bowl Sunday, because he is proposing an all-you-can-eat buffet for an already gorged and bloated government bureaucracy. A couple of years ago, both parties agreed to the Washington equivalent of lap band surgery. It's called sequestration. And when it was enacted for 2013, it reduced spending authority by $85 billion, split evenly between defense and non-defense categories. Instead of calling this Washington-style lap band surgery, it would be better described as Uncle Sam putting a Band-Aid on a brain tumor. Both parties are squawking about the reduced spending authority in defense and non-defense areas while ignoring the exponential growth of entitlements. So Social Security and Medicare and now Obamacare, all those costs continue to rise, and those entitlement costs account for 2/3 of actual government spending. The other 1/3 of that spending is labeled as discretionary, but there's nothing discreet about it. So the president now says, let's end sequestration, as modest as it was, and get back to the not so good old days of taxing and spending. The president thinks raising taxes will raise government revenue, but it deprives the private sector of growth potential that comes from genuine investment. Even though Mr. Obama describes all his spending schemes as investment, that so-called investment only serves to grow government. Meantime, the tax increases he claims will raise revenue, in fact, slow down the overall economy. All this brings us back full circle to the absurdity of government assumptions. Big government proponents always measure tax cuts by what they assume it'll cost government. One change we made when I was in Washington was to introduce reality-based scoring, where we measured tax cuts not by what it cost government, but what it meant for real economic growth. And it is growth in your family budget, not the government budget, that should be the real priority in Washington. But that involves making real cuts. And that's an assumption we should never make about Washington, D.C. At least, that's the way I see it. Straight ahead, Hour 3, Dr. Ben Carson here at the anchor desk when we come back.